A friend of mine a few days ago sent me a link to Sam Harris's latest monologue on his thoughts on the US election that 2 whole weeks down the line still remains unsettled in the minds of many Americans. And even allowing for Trump derangement syndrome, of which Harris is, even by his own admission, perhaps the most well-known sufferer, it was a powerful piece of work, I have to say. I've always respected Harris, believing him to be quite courageous in being prepared to say the unsayable, and especially when it is unpopular. As a casual member of the so-called intellectual dark web, he takes a sideswipe at some unnamed fellow members of the IDW that have, in Harris's opinion, erroneously given credence to the claims that Trump and his team have made that the election was stolen from the American people and fraudulently gifted to Joe Biden. Since my knowledge of the electoral system in the United States is paper thin, I'm not in a position to judge Harris's comments about the election being free and fair, but he makes a pretty convincing case. That he is also a prodigiously intelligent bloke not given to making hyperbolic comments he can't back up. At this precise moment, I'm inclined to agree with him, despite many misgivings. But I'm not an expert, and neither am I savant, and I'm just as likely to be swayed by an opposing viewpoint if delivered as deftly, passionately, and persuasively as Harris has just done. And my misgivings, such as they are, tend to rest on the reality of quite a number of respected and high-profile people, some of them distinguished legal practitioners and scholars who seem quite prepared to risk their considerable reputations on their perhaps outlandish claims. Since those claims have been made, supposedly with yet to be presented evidence, and it is within the law, my feeling is that those claims must be entertained and that evidence tested, however unusual that may be. If Trump is merely attempting to game the system, then surely that will come to light. Americans really have no choice but to trust their system of checks and balances. And it is trust that is the key, and of all the virtues that has come under the greatest stress in the American Republic, as it has elsewhere in the so-called free world, it is trust that has taken the greatest battering. But trust underpins so much of what we take for granted. We trust those that count the votes. We don't think about that much. Trump's claims in this election target that very trust, just where it's needed most. If he's right, and the vote counters are corrupt, then that is deadly serious. But if he's wrong, and those vote counters are trustworthy, but are successfully unfairly portrayed as not being so, then it is hardly less serious. To be a vote counter, you must necessarily believe in the very concept of democracy. Now that makes you someone who is also necessarily interested in politics, interested in the process of democracy, but not its outcome. Just think about that for a moment. Interested in democracy, but not interested in the result. What kind of a saint must you be to hold both of those views at the same time? That must be a pretty rare combination, wouldn't you say? I would. And yet democracies the world over rely on such people. And that's a pretty thin thread on which to base how populations decide who governs them. But trust has to be earned, and it has to be buttressed by a myriad of institutions, and it is easily lost. And once lost, it can stay lost for an extremely long time. And if we come back home to this side of the Atlantic, to our chastened, poisoned and septic isle, it looks to me as if we are in for a pretty bumpy ride for the next 40 years or so. That's the next 2 generations. There will be no peace in my beloved country, I'm forced to accept, for the remainder of my natural life. In Harris's monologue, he says that the tweet of Joyce Aline, a political commentator, who said, "Our institutions will hold," brought a tear to his eye. So worried was he that Trump came so close to, in his view, of stealing the election. Harris should thank his lucky stars that he lives in a country where institutions still have a chance of holding. In the United Kingdom, we have witnessed the fall of the last but one of our cherished institutions, the National Health Service, turn its back on the people it was founded to protect, instead preferring to protect itself. The NHS joins a long and putrid list of previously valued and respected entities that have debased themselves and become the opposite of what their founders intended. Parliament, the Immigration Service, the Border Force, the courts, the Law Society, the Treasury, social services, the police farce, the BBC, education and in particular the universities, the medical scientific community and the civil service in its entirety have been undermined and eventually captured by bad actors intent on imposing their own worldview at the expense of the public that pays their wages. Even the Ministry of Defence, if not quite yet the armed forces themselves, has shown itself willing to enforce government diktats upon the British people, rather than protecting them from foreign aggressors, which is the solitary reason for its existence. But back to Sam Harris, who insists, despite his personal loathing of Trump, that his concern is the survival of the Republic. And he puts his case so persuasively, I'm inclined to agree with him. He cites Trump's basic character and reminds us of his unsuitability to the presidency, highlighting what we all know about the Orange Man. His narcissism, his intemperate language, his turning on those in his camp immediately who expressed the slightest criticisms, and often who he was praising to the heavens not 24 hours previously. All of this we know to be true. But what is also true is that the person that is suitable to be President of the United States is the person who is elected to that office by the electorate of the United States, whatever Harris or any other detractors might think. And that was just a thing about Trump. We all knew, as I'm sure most Americans did know, and still do, that Trump is also a crook. A crook as crooked as Hillary, as his business practices and his conduct and his less than transparent tax affairs attest. But he was crooked in a different, maybe worse, but perhaps less hypocritical way than Hillary was. I don't know, not being an American voter, but maybe that's why Americans took a chance on him. Maybe they thought that his crookedness was immune to the crookedness of the Washington swamp. Maybe they thought it takes a thief to catch a thief. That having him as a wrecking ball was preferable to more of the same. More of the same where politicians talked of the greatness of the American Republic when it suited them, but sold the American people down the river by telling them that it was inevitable that manufacturing was outsourced to China and that they must accept it and take a non-unionised minimum wage job at Walmart instead of the technical, skilled job that they might have had before. Maybe they hoped, as a last-ditched attempt, that putting Trump in the White House might change that. Change for change's sake, just not more of the same. Anything, even a shyster like Trump, rather than more of the same. But Harris's concern is that the shyster really has done damage, and more damage than is visible to the naked eye. The fact that Trump is a liar is obvious, but then so is Biden and Hillary and Obama and Bill Clinton and George W. and DeFeffel Johnson and Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn and anyone else who desires or achieves political power. Anyone who thinks otherwise is irredeemably naive. But maybe the extent and the ever-present nature of the lying, even when it wasn't necessary, has perhaps damaged the concept of truth itself. Maybe. It's a stretch, and one where Harris may be overreaching himself. After all, if Trump is such a moron, then how has he managed to have such a profound effect? But nevertheless, I think he may have a point, if it's true that Trump has made the American public so suspicious of the integrity of the electoral process, and without proposing any credible way of fixing it, then that really is damaging. In fact, there is nothing more corrosive than that, even than the existing right corruption. If the US electoral system is the truth by which Americans choose their leader, and that truth is damaged, or even destroyed, how do you get that back? How do you get truth back? And this is a problem that doesn't only affect Americans. In those heady, far-off days of the Brexit debate, remember how pleasant that was by comparison with what we have now. I remember thinking that a second referendum needed to be avoided at all costs. So shocked were the establishment, and so obvious their attempts to delegitimise the vote, that I seriously and genuinely believed that they would, in fact, cheat by actually rigging the election. And I don't mean by moving the goalposts, or letting 12-year-olds vote, or framing the question in order to split the Leave vote. I mean actually cheating. I mean by having boxes of millions of votes standing by, in case it started to look as if we were going to get the same result, in much the same way as the allegations in the US. After all, if they did decide to cheat, how the fuck would I know? I would have had to take it on trust. A trust that the establishment had spent over 3 years demolishing. And then they wonder why we believe in conspiracy theories. Which leads us nicely back to COVID and where the truth sits. Because what is the truth? Well, let's start at first principles. It's never going to tell the whole story, but it's a start. Have I had COVID? I don't think so. Has anyone in my immediate circle had COVID? Not that I'm aware. Do I know anyone who has had COVID? No. So at this point, COVID in any real sense doesn't actually exist. So let's expand that circle a bit. Have I met anyone who has had COVID? Yes, I have. Or at least I've met someone who said they had COVID. Hooray! Somebody. This was a customer, although she looked pretty healthy to me. But this was only a month or so ago. She said that she'd had it several months ago, and that she told me that she was pretty ill. But that was the first and only person that I've met in the flesh that has said they had COVID. So that's my personal experience. One person in 9 months. However, my personal experience proves nothing, so then we have to look for places where it actually is. And that means media reports. Another way of saying this is that I have to take other people's word for it. Now, that's not a problem. As corrupt as the media is, I don't actually think they're making it up. Although what I do think is that considering that they are meant to be journalists, they do seem to be a desperately incurious bunch. Most of their journalism seems to consist of asking gotcha questions with the aim of embarrassing politicians and inflating their own sense of importance. They certainly don't seem to be interested in truth-seeking or even presenting an alternative point of view, unless that view happens to be that the lockdown should have been earlier, harsher, enforced with greater authoritarianism, with less regard to due process, and to last longer. But staying with the media, we are repeatedly told that there have been 50,000 deaths of COVID, although a more modest total of 37,000 is quoted elsewhere. That might just be the number for England. And in that lower total, it appears that out of that 37,000, a mere 1,664 are deaths from COVID where the victim did not have a pre-existing condition. 1,664 people in 9 months. 1,700 people die in the UK every day from all causes, and they still do, since there also appears to be, from some sources, no year-on-year excess deaths. Until, of course, you look at another source, where the excess deaths are through the roof. And the multiplicity of different media reporting on this, with different axes to grind, make finding the truth of this almost impossible. Added to that, the average age of dying from COVID is 82, which is a year older than the average deaths from all other causes. In these extreme cases, it seems that contracting COVID actually prolongs one's life. Of course, that's not a sensible comparison, but it does illustrate the mismatch of what we are being told. And I do have one piece of anecdotal evidence which I've no reason to disbelieve. There is a guy I've met a couple of times who was walking my dog, and it turns out he is an ICU consultant. That's intensive care, if you're wondering. And I asked him about what he made of the pandemic, and I was quite neutral, so it's not as if he said, yes, I agree with your conspiracy theory about the new economic forum and the Great Reset. But I did ask him if he thought it was like the flu. He said it was much more virulent than the flu, 4 times more to be exact, he said. So it appears to be real and serious, but manageable without shutting the entire country down. He said that it really only affects those over 60 with a pre-existing condition. And then he corrected himself and said, actually, over 70 with a pre-existing condition. And so I asked him generally if he thought our approach to the virus was the correct one, and he said no. Remember, these were neutral questions and without my Citizen X hat on. This was information and opinion that he was dishing up willingly. He said that we just have to manage it by shielding those that are the most vulnerable and letting wider society carry on as normal. Then he said that he was worried about the future for his children and grandchildren and the economic devastation that was coming as a result. Now, I can't trust my personal experience as any kind of barometer, so it may just be chance that the virus has passed me by. But then by the same token, I feel unable to trust the narrative spewed out by the mainstream media, chiefly because they have quite obviously not been asking the correct questions. They have accepted the narrative unquestioningly, disagreeing only on the magnitude of the government's seemingly futile efforts to control it, rather than the policy itself. And that leaves me with social media. To state that I'm unaffected by the media coming my way, mostly from Twitter and YouTube, would be genuinely dishonest. Of course I'm affected by it. But my personal Overton window is tuned, I suppose, by the attacks on our liberties, and I make no apology for that. For years, decades even, it has been ideas of personal liberty that have been shouted down in favour of ever greater encroachments of safetyism. But along with that, I also inevitably get a fair amount of layman's, pseudo, and quite possibly junk science to go with it. Sometimes I tune it out. Often I don't, but mostly I try to get a sense of its veracity by cross-checking it with other unrelated information. But the albeit anecdotal conversation I had with the ICU consultant is the thing that mostly rings true. COVID is real, and it is more serious, much more according to him, than seasonal flu. I must add that there are other highly qualified people who disagree with that assessment and do believe that it is no more deadly than flu. But taking this consultant at his word and allowing for my own instincts does seem to be the most plausible position. In effect, shield the vulnerable and allow the more robust to move amongst it, catch it and develop immunity to it, which is the way of most viruses since time immemorial. So we get back to the truth. What is the truth? To accept what the authorities tell us without question strikes me as idiotically naive, even at the best of times. To do so when our government has deliberately driven the economy off a cliff strikes me as willful stupidity, at best. In the winter of 1968 to 69, 80,000 people in the UK died of Hong Kong flu, which was the most serious epidemic since the Spanish flu 50 years earlier. What was the government's response? Did they shut down the economy? Did they furlough millions of workers on almost full pay? Did they instruct all medium small businesses to cease trading immediately? Were people confined to their homes on pain of arrest and fines? Did they stop all sporting events and close all theatres and cinemas? Were the hospitals overwhelmed? I don't know. I don't know if they did any of that, because all I can find about that outbreak was that 80,000 people died. At least 25,000 more than have died of COVID. And that there was some disruption to mail and railway services. How is it that the government's response was so minimal that I have to trawl the internet to find any reference to it at all? In the modern era, it's certainly not one of the landmark events of British history in the post-war period, like Suez or the 1973 miners' strike and the 3-day week. By contrast, 2020 will seem like an unbelievably irrational act of national self-harm, and one whose scars will last for generations. And yet, despite the death of 80,000 people, the country appears to have shrugged it off and carried on much as before. Sure, COVID is a real, genuine thing, but it's not as much of a thing as the largely forgotten Hong Kong flu was. And Harold Wilson's government never decided that the way to combat a virus was to deliberately drive the country into a brick wall, not to mention remove everyone's liberty at the same time. So why on earth would anybody believe that this is the correct way to respond to an admittedly nasty virus? And that's not even mentioning the extremely credible theories put out by epidemiologists like Michael Yeadon, among others, that the virus has already been and gone, as is the nature of viruses. When someone as learned as that says that the only reason that the pandemic isn't over is because Sage says it isn't, it's got to make you think. And when he publicly challenges his ex-colleague Patrick Vallance by effectively calling him a liar, you have to at least suspect that the science isn't nearly as settled as we are led to believe. And naked and rather clumsy attempts to discredit him and Dr. Carl Hennigan, or just trying to shut them up via some very crude and transparent censorship, not only insults the intelligence of ordinary people trying to make sense of something baffling, but also doesn't bode well for truth after COVID, if there ever is such a thing again, which at this rate can hardly be a foregone conclusion. And the truth will be required more than ever when it comes to the cavalry coming over the hill in the form of the much vaunted vaccine. And despite the absolute necessity of truth, I doubt it will be forthcoming. Instead of concrete assurances, we will be expected to take it on faith. As I've said before, I am a recipient of the wonderful science of vaccination, just like almost everyone else. I still have the scar on my shoulder. So despite the accusations I have received recently of being an anti-vaxxer, I'm nothing of the kind. I am just anti this vaccine, for the pure and simple reason that it has not been tested for long enough. I'm sure that it will have been tested as thoroughly as possible, given the time available. But time is the one thing you can't cut corners with. Time is, quite literally, of the essence where vaccines are concerned. Not that I'm an expert, in that I'm only marginally more knowledgeable about such things than my dog. In fact, I know almost nothing except that when you're administering a cocktail of different chemicals into a human body, the only way that you'll know if it is safe over time is if a suitable amount of time has elapsed. And there is no shortcut to that. And yet, barely 9 months into its development, we are being told that it is safe. And if anyone is feeling a little queasy about that, the carrot of a return to normal life is dangled in front of the unsure, with the stick of all the things you won't be able to do unless you get with the programme, menacingly thwacked against the jackboot for good measure, just in case someone who maybe remembers the thalidomide catastrophe decides to ask any awkward questions like, why are the drug companies being shielded from liability? And it is not a conspiracy theory to question the safety of a vaccine that has not undergone the full panoply of tests before injecting it into people. That's not entertaining a conspiracy theory, that's just skepticism, which is a healthy and, dare I say it, necessary approach to living in the modern world. A modern world where actors are incentivised to further the interests of those they work for rather than for the common good. And that's a skepticism that has been sorely lacking in those we rely on to ask those awkward questions and to ferret out the truth. Journalists. But in the search for truth, having been betrayed by our institutions and abandoned by the press, we have only ourselves to rely on and to try and distinguish between fact and fantasy. And sometimes we get it wrong. But when politicians mess with the truth, they mess with trust. And once trust goes, very often the truth goes with it. And without truth, which no side has a monopoly on, we really are lost. Let's hope we can find our way again.